Hi everybody. So we are into the ending of an inspector calls, and before we start thinking about what actually happens in the ending, let's have a think about one more time theorist, because today our learning question is, can I understand the significance of the ending of an inspector calls? And secondly, which will really help you understand the significance, can I understand Ouspensky's theory of time and how J.B. Priestley uses it to structure an inspector calls? So you've got a nice picture of the Russian philosopher P.D. Ouspensky just there wearing his hat. And he was, like Donne, a philosopher, and he explored concepts of time. And the concept of time that we're interested in for this is the theory of eternal recurrence. So it's actually a different philosopher called Nietzsche who came up with this theory of eternal recurrence. As it says on the screen, very simply, this theory puts forward or posits that when you die, you're reborn into the same body, repeating the same life for eternity. And it's really similar to belief to Hinduism, ideas in Hinduism about the afterlife, and ideas in Buddhism about the afterlife. And because he's a philosopher, not a religious man, what he says is, I'm not telling you that this is the truth and this is what happens. I'm telling you to imagine that this was the truth. And if this was the truth and you were being reborn, what changes would you make to your life to make sure that you can escape this eternal reoccurrence? What can you do to make sure that when you're reborn again, you can have a better existence next time? And that's what J.B. Priestley is asking as well. When things keep coming full circle, when we keep repeating our lives over and over again, are we going to do something different when we're reborn, or when we're given a new opportunity? Are we going to do something different, or are we going to carry on making the same old mistakes? Now, you may have heard of a film called Groundhog Day. And it's exactly this theory that Groundhog Day works on. So it's an actor called Bill Murray, and he keeps on waking up to the same day. The same day happens over and over again. And each time he just has to make a small change, and he has to address his horrible behavior until then when he makes a small change, things work out a little bit better for him each time, until he gets it completely right, because he's learning his lesson. He learns how he has to behave and what he has to do. Okay, so that's the theory, which really helps J.B. Priestley to structure the end of the play. So your next task, as usual then, is to watch the end of an inspector course. You've got about 10-12 minutes more to watch. It might be a bit of crossover from last time. So if you remember, Eric and Sheila, one generation, the young generation, the Mr. and Mrs. Burling, the old generation. Mr. and Mrs. Burling, when they learn that Inspector Gould is a fake, they seem to forget everything that they have learnt, whereas Sheila and Eric are still really affected by everything that they've done, and they're still feeling really guilty. So let's see how it all ends. Remember, as usual, follow along in your script, because some lines get skipped out and some lines get changed, and it's the script that you're going to be examined on, not the film version. And as usual, the link is in the description below, and it should be coming up in the information card up above as well. I'll see you back here in about 12 minutes. Bye for now. Okie dokie. So some of the annotations we're going to be doing very much kind of carrying on from last week, but we're also going to be looking at structure as well. I'll be honest with you, there's not much zooming in going on here. We're not going to be doing that kind of close analysis, because at the end of the play is a structure that I'm much more interested in. So if we have a look then, Burling is trying to talk Sheila and Eric round and try and say, let's talk calmly and sensibly about everything. And Eric and Sheila are having none of it. Eric is bursting out. What's the use of behaving sensibly? And the fact that he's just coming out with these words shows his frustration at his parents. But do you remember Eric at the beginning? He was half shy, half assertive. Now he's bursting out with things. Sheila, look, she's speaking eagerly. Eric down here, he's shouting. These youngsters, they're not keeping their voice quiet anymore. They want to get their ideas across. They want to be listened to. They want to influence the older generation. And what J.B. Priestley, the point that he's kind of making here is the young people in 1945, when he's writing the play and when the play is being watched, it's the young people who are going to make the difference. And the young people can't keep quiet and they can't keep cowering away from the older generation anymore. They need to make their voices heard, and we're seeing that here. But what we're also seeing from J.B. Priestley, with Eric and Sheila working together, working in tandem, that if the young people bond together, if they stick together, they're making a stronger force to stand up to the older generation, and they're much stronger working together than trying to work in isolation. And that's the point that J.B. Priestley is trying to send out to the audience in 1945. Come on, guys, if we want to make change, it's not up to these oldies. They're not going to change. It's up to you youngsters. You're the ones who've got to push through this change. For goodness sake, you're the ones who've been working the land, girls, while the men have been away. You girls are the ones who've been working in the munitions factory. You're strong and you're feisty. You boys, you have been out fighting against the Germans and against the Italians and against the Japanese. You've been out there fighting the Second World War. Now's the time to make your voice heard and stop putting up with all this nonsense, all these old-fashioned views from the old generation. And you can see how he's demonstrating it all the way back in 1912, where the play's set, with these two, Sheila and Eric, finding their voice and shouting out loudly, and with their eagerness and their willingness to do something and wanting to hear their voices, wanting the older generation to hear them and to listen to them. So we've got the frustration at the parents, but really J.B. Priestley is making a much bigger message here. And they're not just talking, they're questioning as well. Why are we behaving sensibly? She's still dead, isn't she? No one's brought her to life, have they? And Eric's questioning as well. And you can see them bonding there and that green highlighting as well. Then we go back to this idea of the inspector being like a conscience. And Eric is really, really taking this on board. I did what I did, Mother did what she did, the rest of you did what you did to her. It's the same rotten story, whether it's been told to a police inspector or someone else. And it's almost like Eric has used police inspector, like as a priest, he's confessed to him. And now that he's confessed to him, he is comfortable with talking about what he's done to anybody. And it shows that he's remorseful. So he's confessing now to Gerald, I stole some money, Gerald. He's confessing he is remorseful. He shows that he knows that what he did was wrong. He's showing remorse there. And then Sheila picks up on this motif of time. You're just beginning to pretend all over again. And what Sheila means by this is this kind of like pretend that our actions don't have an impact on someone else, like Mrs. Burling previously pretending that she didn't recognise that photograph of Eva Smith. Mr. Burling not realising, not facing up to the fact that if he paid his girls properly, they wouldn't find it so hard to get on in their lives. And then we get a real insight into Mrs. Burling's character here and this middle class obsession with manners. Burling is getting angry because he's used to the one being in control. He goes, for God's sake. Now, obviously, nowadays, that's a very, very mild thing to say. But in 1912, like taking the Lord's name in vain was considered blasphemy, like swearing. And Mrs. Burling, despite everything that's gone on, she's telling off Mr. Burling about his manners, even though a girl is dead, even though her son has got a girl pregnant, and everything that's going on. But she's still ticking off her husband for saying, for God's sake. And you're like, come on, Mrs. Burling, get some perspective here, please. So down here, as I said, Eric's shouting, but Mr. Burling is also shouting, but now he has to shout because that's the only way he can make himself heard. We've got this real conflict now between the older and the younger generation. Eric isn't he's not going to be just shy. He's not content to sit there all shyly anymore. He wants his voice to be heard. And I say the girl's dead and we all helped to kill her. And this is almost a direct quotation from what Inspector Gould said, you all helped to kill her, just before he gave that big speech and left. So Eric has internalized and now is using Inspector Gould's words there. So again, Mr. Burling, we can see where his priorities lie. You can give me an account of that money you stole. And Sheila is saying that won't bring Eva Smith back to life, will it? So whilst Mr. Burling is still worried about the scandal and the loss of money, he's forgotten that a girl has died, a girl who is carrying his grandchild, the baby, this unborn baby. And he seems to have forgotten all about that. He's only concerned with the money, which is really highlighting his capitalist beliefs that only money is important, that profit is everything. So Gerald, if you remember, I said earlier that in a previous lesson, J.B. Priestley uses Gerald as a dramatic device. So not so much as a really convincing, believable character, but just as a device to kind of keep the plot going and to help the others work out what they need to work out. So Gerald is back into Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple mode. So he's like the detective himself. We all helped to kill her. Is it a fact? Says Gerald. Of course it is. You don't know the whole story. So Gerald says, well, it is a fact that I kept a girl last summer. And Sheila says, is that what you're trying to say? And again, Gerald, like Eric, he is remorseful and he says sorry to Sheila. You kind of believe that he means it, but although he shows remorse, it doesn't show that he wants to repent. So he doesn't want to do something like change his personality and the way that he acts to atone for his sin. So he does feel guilty about what he's done. He's sorry that he did it, but he's probably not going to change his attitudes and his values or his ways. Okay, so not too many annotations on this page because really what we're getting is Gerald just working through this puzzle. So like I said previously, Gerald through this little section is acting like a detective to try and reveal the hoax that has been perpetrated upon the Burling family. You've got another example here of the conflict between the older and the younger generation. So Burling speaks angrily. He wasn't an inspector, and Sheila is flaring up. Well, he inspected us all right. And it's I love this word flaring here because it shows fire. So obviously it's a conceptual metaphor. When you flare up, maybe your face will go red because that anger hits you. It's almost like seeing the red mist. But it also shows that Sheila has almost like come alive. She's got this fire inside her, like this passion inside her, which is righteously ignited now. She's not just passionate because some girl has looked prettier in a dress than her. She's not just teasing her dad and teasing Gerald like she was at the beginning when she was just a silly flirtatious girl. Now she's flaring up. She's got fire in her body. It's almost as if she's coming alive. So what I was saying, this conflict is showing how the younger generation are finding their voice and they're finding their passion. And this is J.B. Priestley's message, that that's what the younger generation in 1945 have to do. She's speaking bluntly now. She's not trying to pretty up her language, saying, oh, isn't it a shame she lost her life? We drove that girl to commit commit suicide. She's using adult language, accurate terminology. She's not trying to use euphemisms to pretty up what happened. She's been blunt like the inspector. Okay, so I've just put down here this idea about the younger generation determined to have their voices heard. And there's an AO3 context point, because that's exactly what J.B. Priestley in 1945 is that's his message in the play, that the youngsters, the younger generation, the ones who've been out fighting the war or keeping the country going whilst the men have been away fighting, they're the ones who've got to fight for social justice and social change. Okay, in the meantime though, Gerald has very much gone back to being a little smug posh boy, as I call him. Don't write that in your essay. So typical kind of smug upper class chap. Did we drive that girl to commit suicide? Who says so? So he's trying to show how clever he is, and that's all the annotations for that page. That's nice. Okay, and again, we haven't got too many annotations here because this is all what we call the denouement of the play. It's kind of, well, we think it is. All the loose ends are being tied up and the Burling family are trying to make sense of what happened. So Mrs. Burling, even she notes, I answered more or less as he wanted me to answer. So is this idea of conscience. In my next video, we're going to explore this idea of conscience, a bit like in Pinocchio, the little Jiminy Cricket fellow who's always talking to Pinocchio and trying to make him make the right choices. It took a lot of digging for the inspector to dig out Mrs. Burling's conscience, but when he did, she did indeed answer more or less as he wanted her to answer. So perhaps the inspector isn't something real, but he's something within ourselves, this idea of conscience. Okay, so let's have a look at Mr. Burling's interpretation of what the inspector is. He says, wait a minute, don't be in such a hurry to put yourself into court, Eric, this is. That interview with your mother could have been just as much a put-up job like all this police inspector business. The whole damned thing can have been a piece of bluff, and what he means by piece of bluff is part of the hoax. So what Mr. Burling is saying here is that this is all part of a really, really elaborate and complex plan to basically kind of prank and shame Mr. Burling. And actually, the girl who called herself Mrs. Burling, who went to Mrs. Burling's charity, perhaps she was part of this hoax or this prank, some kind of actress or something, and went along just to kind of round the story up. And the thing is, Sheila and Eric, they don't actually care. I think Eric obviously cares if she's dead or not, because that's a big deal. But really, they're more concerned, like, it doesn't matter if we had 5 different Eva Smiths or if there's just one Eva Smith, we still all did the things that we did to a girl, even if it happens not to be this one, even if it happens not to end badly. Whereas Mr. Burling just thinks it's all a bluff, like some people trying to get their own back on him for something. Okay, and I noticed in this section, Mr. Burling keeps saying we're having a little celebration and feeling rather pleased with ourselves. And he repeats this quite a lot, feeling rather pleased with ourselves. And again, is it this idea of conscience that actually he has gotten to feeling a little bit guilty that he was feeling so smug and so pleased with himself and the rest of them earlier when they didn't have much reason for such smugness. I'll explore that a bit more in a minute. Okay, so Mr. Burling keeps kind of working through it. A girl's just died in the infirmary, drank some strong disinfectant, died in agony. And Eric starts getting upset. Again, don't pile it on. And Burling's going, I proved it then. Yeah, he's using this emotive language. He's just repeating it, shakes you a bit. So he's trying to say it's a really clever hoax. Someone who knew how to use language has come in here and hoaxed us, and it's working already. Okay, so what does what does worry Burling is still his reputation. And again, it's kind of a little 803 historical context point. If you're a man who's a social climber, someone who's got himself from the working classes up to the middle classes through kind of climbing this greasy ladder. They say that the working classes had didn't really care about their reputation too much, work hard for a living and do their thing. But this kind of obsession with reputation is a very middle class thing. If Burling gets his knighthood and makes it into the upper classes, very, very edge at the upper classes, then perhaps he can stop worrying about his reputation all the time. But it is a very middle class thing to do, always worrying. And you see that from Mrs. Burling, as we saw a little bit earlier, always correcting him on his manners, and it is that obsession with acting and behaving the way that you're meant to. So Gerald picks up the phone, and the phone is a big old dramatic device in this last act where the phone cuts in. I put this little 1910s phone so you can see where the phone's being used and what it's being used for. So here the phone is changing the mood, and previously at the beginning of the play it was the ring of the doorbell that changed the mood along with the lighting change, if you remember when the inspector came in. So here this phone is definitely going to change the mood. Let's see why. So is at the infirmary, we're worried about an employee, and Gerald finishes, no girl has died in there today. Nobody's been brought in after drinking disinfectant. They haven't had a suicide for months. So Gerald himself is using that rhetorical technique for list of three, triple, a triad, whatever you like to call it. And what he's done in that list of three is he's stacked up all the negatives, and that's what's going to lighten the mood. So that phone call, that little ring of the bell as he would have picked up the receiver, that's changed the moods, like the bell rings and the mood changes. Look at the negatives. No, nobody, haven't, have not. It's short for, isn't it? So all those negatives being stacked up there. And then what we have down here, go away, are all signs that old Mr. Burling is feeling very, very pleased with himself, like that quotation. So remember at the beginning, and this is what J.B. Priestley is reminding us, at the beginning they were all very pleased with himself, and now Mr. Burling is very pleased with himself again. He's triumphant, triumphantly, there you are, proof positive. Just a lot of moonshine, a huge sigh of relief. Okay, so he's pleased with himself again. He smiles the more he's back to his avuncular best, smiling graciously, looking down on his family. Now, the other thing that you'll see, I'm using this symbol here, a little refresh symbol, because this is everything that happened earlier is being repeated now and refreshed. So it's exactly the same as earlier, but with some subtle differences. So let's have a look. Gerald, have a drink. It's a repeat from earlier. Earlier, they were celebrating Sheila and Gerald's engagement with champagne before the audience came in, if you like, and then with a glass of port. And now they're celebrating the fact that it's been proved it's all a hoax with a drink. And then Mrs. Burling almost repeats exactly the same words she used in Act 1. Gerald, you argued this very cleverly. And I put like the timing of the ring. Do you remember earlier when Gerald gives Sheila the engagement ring at the end of the meal? And she says, oh, how clever, Gerald. So she's even repeating the same kind of words that she used earlier. And then we've got a toast from Mr. Burling. Do you remember earlier? And they said, come on, Mr. Burling, what about this famous toast of yours? Come on, Arthur. He has his drink now and raises the glass. That's a sign of a toast, isn't it? Raising your glass. Here's to us, he said. So earlier it was, here's to Sheila and Gerald. They raised a glass. Now he's toasting us. So there's an exact repeat of what happened earlier. I'm hoping that you're thinking about Ouspensky's theory of time, the recurrence. It's like the whole Burling family and Gerald had an opportunity. The inspector walks out and he gives him a speech and he leaves. And he's kind of like, right, it's up to you what you do with this now. I've done my part and it's up to you what you do with it. You've got a fresh chance. And what happens with a fresh chance? They uncover the truth. And after they uncover the truth, Mr. and Mrs. Burling and Gerald, to an extent, decide just to carry on regardless, doing what they were doing before. Eric and Sheila, however, have changed. And now we can see, because they've made the wrong choice, that they have been reborn into this circle. And here we go again. Everything's repeating itself from earlier. That's not the end. So Mr. Burling is now speaking jovially. He's celebrating. He's speaking heartily. He's celebrating. Sheila, however, shows that she has changed. She's tense. She's speaking tensely. And then she speaks passionately, of pretending everything is just as it was before. So you can see that Sheila and Eric are not celebrating. They're not picking up the drink. They're not toasting to their success. Sheila and Eric have made those changes. It makes you wonder, is it going to keep repeating for Sheila and Eric, or are they going to be out of it? So I noticed just here that Mr. Burling is now calling Sheila a young woman, and Sheila is going to bed. If Mr. Burling now is starting to recognise that Sheila has grown up a little bit. Sheila isn't just worried about her parents, she's frightened. It frightens me the way that you talk. She's frightened of her parents. She can't believe that there are people who can't learn a lesson. She's frightened because she knows that so many of their friends are exactly the same. Mr. Burling says, look, you better ask for Gerald for that ring back. Then you'll feel better. And I've just put here who will feel better, because actually I think it's Mr. Burling who will feel much better when Sheila's got that ring back on her finger. And Sheila, certainly as we find out down here, doesn't really care for the ring anymore. She says it's too soon. So you can see Sheila doesn't accept the ring. Here we are. No, not yet. It's too soon, I must think. So that's not repeating from earlier. Is it earlier? She took the ring and she was so excited. Look, mummy, isn't it a beauty? Really, really excited about the ring. Here she says, no, not yet. She's not celebrating. She's not accepting the ring. So they're not repeating their behaviour. Sheila is still echoing Inspector Gould's words. She's hoping to have that same impact that he had, but it's falling on deaf ears. I tell you, that's exactly what the inspector said. I tell you, if man will not learn that lesson, no, he'll learn it in fire and blood and anguish. And then she mentions exactly that. I remember what he said, how he looked, how he made me feel. So I tell you, fire and blood and anguish we've got. And she repeats it. It frightens me the way you talk. I can't listen to any more of it. Eric agrees with Sheila. So you've got that bonding again between the younger generation, the same members of the younger generation. Mrs. Burling can't even acknowledge that Eric and Sheila have grown up, even though she knows now that her son has got a girl pregnant and stolen through fiddling the accounts, Mr. Burling. And she still talks as if they're both children. In the morning they'll be as amused as we are, because all they need is a good night's sleep. And then we get Gerald, as I mentioned. So we've got another repeat. So I'll put repeat, 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 repeat. And I've got this little symbol by them. Everything's all right now, Sheila. What about this ring? So he's trying for the engagement again. No, she says, too soon. She's not changing. And then I've just noticed here, if you have a look, Mr. Burling, he's standing, he's pointing. He's the one who's saying everything. He's back in control, just like in Act 1. He's the one who's talking and saying stupid things again. So they can't even take a joke. The famous younger generation who know it all. So where have I annotated this? Yeah, another repeat, because as he's saying that, the younger generation can't take a joke. The telephone rings, and there's my telephone symbol again. It doesn't just ring, it rings sharply. So it's quite a shocking sound, comes out of the blue. And do you remember earlier the ring of the front doorbell, the sharp ring of the front doorbell interrupted Mr. Burling's stupid comments in Act 1, where he was saying a man has to look after himself, and his family, of course, and the bell rung and in came the inspector. It's not the doorbell this time, it's the telephone. Remember in Act 3 how the telephone's being used as this dramatic device to mark the change of mood. We're going to have a change of mood, and that's marked out by the ring of the bell and then a moment's complete silence. Really powerful silence and space on a stage. I said to you last lesson that watch the characters who aren't talking in a stage show. You kind of get drawn into the characters who are talking, but sometimes there's more significance in keeping an eye on the ones who don't have any lines. And here you've just got silence on the stage, and right before the end of the play would really create a worrying atmosphere, that silence. So we get the phone call snippets, very, very short. Mr. Burling speaking, what, here? The other person's rung off, so it's really short and blunt again. He puts the telephone down slowly, looks in panic-stricken fashion, so that mood is changing. He's gone from celebrating, pointing at Eric and Sheila, laughing definitely in some versions of the play that I've seen, and just like really, really up mood, like full circle back to the beginning when he's so pleased with himself. But here we've now got the change of mood, the falling mood again. That was the police. A girl's just died on her way to the infirmary after swallowing some disinfectant. And a police inspector is on his way here to ask some questions. So obviously that repeats from earlier. If you remember, Edna earlier said an inspector, a police inspector, he says his name's Mr. Gould, he's come here to ask some questions. So almost total repeat from earlier, but this time it's not Edna who's bringing the news, it's the telephone. Okay, so loads and loads of repeats from earlier. It's what we call a circular structure. So although the play is linear, it starts like at the end of dinner and it kind of goes through an hour and a half of the interviews and everything. It's kind of come full circle and everything's back to when the inspector first came in again. So the only other question that I put down on the annotation is, what is the significance of Eva Smith choosing to kill herself by swallowing disinfectant? And I think most people would analyse this by saying that the Burlings, their contact with her, have dirtied her and sullied her so much that she feels like she just needs to clean them all out of her system. She needs to wash away the taint of their sins. And if you remember, we talked about the Burlings representing the seven deadly sins, or 6 of the 7 deadly sins, and she just wants to wash those off herself, like from her inside out, which the inspector said quite a lot. So that is the end of the play. And I think it's a really, really dramatic ending, which will certainly get the audience talking. They've got plenty to talk about on their way home. And if they're recommending this play to their friends, a really big twist at the end. Okay, so what we're going to think about now is another couple of structural or generic genre devices. The first one is the well-made play, and most people would describe Inspector Calls as a well-made play. So I'll just read through this and explain it as I go. Well-made play is a literary name for a type of play that was very popular in the early 19th century, so in the 1800s, and it remained popular for about 150 years, so through until about 1950. So you can see that J.B. Priestley is quite late within its popularity to pick up on that. What a well-made play means is the story has a tight plot. The play has a tight plot. It follows traditional story structure, so really, really similar to Story Mountain that you learnt about all the way back in year 1 or year 2 in primary school, and probably used in one form or another ever since when you've written a story. It's also really similar to Aristotle's tragic hero plot lines. So what we've tried to put on top of Macbeth when we were studying Macbeth. Okay, so like, you should recognize all of this, really. The exposition at the beginning, and we learn about the characters and the setting. But in a well-made play, what we find out is most of the actual action, what actually happened before the play started, and that's certainly the case in Inspector Calls. The audience learn about what's happened to the protagonist. Protagonist is like the hero of a play, and certainly the person that you get behind. And in a way, Inspector Calls is a little bit different and a little bit weird, because the protagonist of our play, when we look at what a well-made play means, and not just that, but when we look at what a morality play is, which is also the way that people see it in Inspector Calls, the protagonist of the play isn't even in it, because the hero of the play is actually Eva Smith by these definitions. And if you don't agree that it's Eva Smith, I want you to have a think about who you think the protagonist could be, because I've been puzzling over this too. If it's not Eva Smith, then who is it? But it's very strange to have a play where the main character isn't even in the play. Anyway, so we learn about what happens to the protagonist in the exposition. Yeah, so we find out what happened to Eva Smith in Act 1 and Act 2 and a little bit into Act 3. So kind of all the way up to the crisis climax and a little bit afterwards as well. And then you have the climax where the protagonist experiences a reversal of fortunes. We know from Macbeth that this is peripeteia. That's what we call it. So it's like everything was going really well for Macbeth, and then Banquo's ghost turns up, and then everything starts going downhill. That's what happens in a tragedy. But in a well-made play, what's meant to happen is the protagonist, when they have their peripeteic moment, everything is meant to go really well for them, because it's all leading up to the resolution, which is meant to be a happy ending in a well-made play. Now, the thing is, if Eva Smith is our protagonist, she definitely doesn't have a happy ending. So J.B. Priestley is playing with this form of the well-made play and kind of twisting it as well. Definitely Eva Smith is more of a tragic hero than like a romantic comedy hero or a well-made play hero. So then you get your climax about 2/3 of the way through, and I think that we all agreed that our crisis climactic moment was when we learned that Eric is father of the baby. Definitely a moment of peripeteia, a real reversal of fortune for Eva Smith herself, because back in 1912 there's not a lot you can do about that. So in the falling action, we get our denouement, where basically all the loose ends are tied up and all our questions are answered. And then, as I said, in a well-made play, the resolution is meant to be a happy ending. We definitely don't get that here. There are some other factors to the well-made play. So as well as this traditional structure, we also need the classical unities. So what the ancient Greeks in their theatre called the unities of time and place. So it's plot, time and place. And what it means is the plot takes place in real time in the same place. So everything that happens in Inspector Calls happens within the 1.5 hours of stage time. It happens in real time. Obviously, we get the idea of the circular structure, but actually things happen in a linear way. And it's just J.B. Priestley toying with the characters and the audience that give us that circular. And then obviously that framing device that we taught when the inspector comes in and then when he leaves. So it's almost like a play within a play there as well. So the unities of time and place is mainly linear, and it certainly happens in one place. That's a tick for, is it a well-made play? So here are some other plot points which are really typical in a well-made play. Key information is kept from some characters, but known, I should say, to others. So definitely each character knows what they did to a girl, but they don't find that out until the story unfolds, the fact that it's all connected. We learn about the actions that happen before the play starts. So everything that happened to Eva Smith happened at least 2 weeks before the play starts. It says the audience has to feel sympathy for the protagonist. Well, I think that most of the audience would feel sorry for Eva Smith as her story unfolds. The plot moves forward in a chain of actions, where this is exactly the terminology that the inspector, or J.B. Priestley, gives the inspector to use, isn't it? A chain of events. So it's the fact that what Mr. Burling did led to Sheila's actions, led to Gerald's actions, led to Eva being back in the palace bar, led to Eric's actions, and Mrs. Burling's actions, those last two have flipped, like for dramatic effect. It says in the climax, the protagonist triumphs, and this is where, again, J.B. Priestley's playing with the form, because she certainly does not triumph, does she? Although Mrs. Burling seems to think that she's triumphing, coming in there, calling herself Mrs. Burling. Apart from these 4 points, there's a couple of others which J.B. Priestley definitely uses in his play. Letters or papers fall into unintended hands to bring about plot twists and climaxes. So yeah, we've got this rough sort of diary, as quotation, rough sort of diary that Eva Smith kept. And it's those papers, that diary, that lead Inspector Gould to have all the information and to link the Burling family together. And then the last 2 points are kind of linked. A character is often revealed to be not who they say they are. Obviously, the inspector. And then the last one, mistaken or mysterious identity can form the basis of plot complications. That certainly gives us a very, very interesting ending in Inspector Calls. So the question is, to what extent is an Inspector Calls a well-made play? I'd say to a very high extent it is a well-made play. It follows many of these rules, but why it's not a well-made play is because we get that twist at the end. So it's not a happy ending, it's a recurring ending where everything starts repeating. It's a really good ending, and you do feel like, with Eric and Sheila absenting themselves going up to bed, that Gerald, Mr. and Mrs. Burling are really going to get grilled by whoever this new inspector is. So it's a very kind of satisfying ending, because you do feel that the old Burlings will get their comeuppance, but it's certainly not like a happy ending with that twist at the end, and actually a lack of resolution or a lack of coda, so we don't know what's going to happen as an audience. That's for us to discuss and decide. And why it's not a well-made play is because the protagonist isn't in it. So that's a really weird little thing that J.B. Priestley does there. Now, if you watch an alternative production, such as the old movie version from the 1950s and the more recent BBC version, Eva Smith is in it in scenes that they show in flashback, and it's well worth thinking about what the effect is on J.B. Priestley's message if you actually include Eva Smith in the film, so that you've seen her as an audience, you've seen her all the way through it. When they say, oh, it could be 5 different girls, does that alter your opinion? Does that make you think, well, like Sheila and Eric, it doesn't matter if it was 5 different girls, because we all did what we did to her and it's still disgusting. So think about the effect of actually putting the protagonist into a filmed version of the play, because it makes it into more of a well-made play, but it really kind of changes the meaning and the impact that J.B. Priestley wanted to make for his audience. Okay, we're going to finish up thinking about, is it a morality play? So morality plays go back even further in time than the well-made plays. Morality plays were popular in the 15th and 16th century, so the 14 and 1500s. And they are allegorical. And what this means is when you take a very, very specific story, but this specific story has a much wider meaning to the general population, if you like. So it could be a morality play, could be something like an Aesop's tale, like about a naughty fox or something like that. So although it seems to be about two animals, in actual fact, it's sending out a message about maybe how we should treat people. So definitely with Inspector Calls, it's not just aimed at us thinking about the Burling family, it's aimed at the audience to get you to think about your own behaviour and the way that you act towards other people. What a morality play will also do is personify abstract concepts. So, for example, you might have a character which is representing death, and you might have a character which is representing like modesty, for example. Now, we know this already because we've looked at this a couple of times. In an Inspector Calls, each character, many critics argue, personifies one of the 7 deadly sins. So you've got Sheila for jealousy, and you've got Mrs. Burling for pride, and Mr. Burling for greed, haven't you? So you've got all those 7 deadly sins represented by each of the characters. So in that way, Inspector Calls definitely seems to fit the genre of morality play. And then the idea of these personified concepts is they're meant to challenge and test the protagonist's morality. So it's like, I'm going to show you greed. How are you going to stand up to greed? I'm going to put jealousy in your path. How are you going to handle someone being jealous of you, to see how that protagonist will cope? And that's definitely what happens to Eva Smith. One of the characters is called Everyman. So it's like an everyman character. And it says in a morality play, the protagonist would usually be this everyman character who's meant to represent the whole of humanity. And if we think back to Eva Smith, analysing her name in a bubble, which we did a few weeks ago, Eva, you remember I said, sounds a bit like every, and Smith is the most common working class name in England. So Every Smith, she certainly is this everyman character, and she's meant to represent the whole of the working classes, so the huge majority of the population in 1912 and 1945. And then finally, in a morality play, kind of obviously, a moral lesson is taught. But in a way, the moral lesson's meant to be taught to the everyman character, and this is where Inspector Calls goes off it a little bit, because in Inspector Calls, it's actually, well, it's meant to be the Burlings and Gerald who learn the moral lesson, and the audience, of course. Whereas in a morality play, it should be the everyman character who learns a moral lesson. So in a way, it should be the middle classes, the people above the working classes here, who are the ones who are likely to be in the theatre. They're represented by the Burling family on the stage, and they're the ones who are meant to be learning this message. So what we've got here are two really kind of really old, like quite old-fashioned, and actually the well-made play was getting quite sneered at and looked down on by the time this play was written. It's very safe and very conventional and very conservative, and this really ancient tradition of a morality play. And why is J.B. Priestley using these very old-fashioned forms to craft his play? Well, I'll go back to the point that I made. He's aiming this not at the working classes who may be looking for something a little bit different, but he's aiming it at the middle classes. And the middle classes tend to be conservative with a small c, so very old-fashioned and very traditional in their views and beliefs and their attitudes. And they like something old-fashioned and traditional. It's kind of lulling them into this false sense of security and sucking them in. We're just going to see a crime drama, murder mystery, whodunit, a well-made play. Like all these old-fashioned ideas that will lull them to a pleasant evening at the theatre. And then he's actually hitting them with a moral and political message. But his political message is coming through this really old-fashioned idea of the morality play. So again, it's all about the author's intentions. In some of J.B. Priestley's other plays, he was a lot more forward-thinking in his use of stagecraft and so on. But in and in spectacles. He makes it feel comfortable, feel small c conservative, old-fashioned, traditional, to try and like lull the audience into a full sense of security before whacking them with his powerful political message. So that is the end of that. Have a look at my video about who is the inspector, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.